who tells you he lied after he's caught. I'm going to tell you I lied, and then I'm just going to go ahead and do it, right? So that's why I'll never be in politics. So about a week or so ago, I was listening to a podcast, and they were talking about the story of Joseph, and it got me really excited. And so since then, I've been diving into the story a little bit more. And so if you don't mind, tomorrow you'll start the story of Joseph. So I'd like to start tomorrow's reading today. And the story of Joseph will bleed into next week. So tonight, yes.
It's foreshadowing.
Yeah, that's what I'm spoiler alert, Actually, we won't really get to Joseph today. But tonight, Sunday night, and next Wednesday, I want to talk about the broad story arc of Joseph. Now, today I want to introduce it. And by introducing it, I mean that if you can follow along with what we do today, as you start tomorrow in the story of Joseph, and you're not doing all of the story of Joseph, but you'll do chunks you'll recognize. Things will leap off the page you may not otherwise have seen. But once you see it, you'll always see it. It's what I've been trying to do at the Capitol with the Gospel of John, focusing on 4 L's, Logos, Life, Light, Lamb. The goal is that when those themes are introduced, every time you go back over John, they jump off the page. That's been really rewarding to me. So that's my goal today. So I want to read a little bit of Genesis 37, which you'll start tomorrow. But we're not actually going to exegete this. But you'll see that what it is that we're talking about. So I'm going to do a biblical theology of here, and from Genesis to Revelation. But the theme is found in the opening verses of the Joseph story, okay? And we know this is the Joseph story, that there's a transition in Genesis because of how it begins. Jacob lived in the land of his father, sojourning in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. We've seen that phrase for Adam, Seth, Cain, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? When you see that phrase, these are the generations of blank, that's a change in the narrative of the story. So Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wife. So there you go, ladies. You're actually about the mandrakes, And so Moses is reminding you his family's messed up, just messed up. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. He's a tattletale. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons. We'll talk about this Sunday night, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Okay? So, with that said, the story of Genesis is a cycle of fall and grace. You've probably noticed this, right? I think Mary mentioned earlier that these guys that we hold up as heroes, and rightly so, they're terrible human beings, right? And the real miracle of the story is being forthright with how bad they are. It's a genuine miracle, the grace God continues to show to them. And that is the key to understanding the Bible. It's really the key to understanding Christianity and the church. We err when we think that we've bypassed that pattern of needing grace. It's actually the opposite. We are in constant need of grace, even after we embrace Christ. In fact, we see that with each generation is essentially an increase of sin. So Mary asked me earlier about the mandrakes and all that sort of stuff. It said, what you get in the story of Jacob is a repetition of Abraham, right? So Abraham had one wife, and then he had a servant girl he got pregnant. Jacob had 2 wives and 2 servant girls, all of which he got pregnant. It's a doubling of it. And that's the pattern you see. So this past Sunday night, we looked at Isaac does essentially the same thing that his father did, right? Now, he doesn't go to Egypt, but then he still lies about his wife, Rebekah, as Abraham had. So that's the pattern, right? Remember, in Hebrew mindset, in the Christian mindset, history is not linear, nor is it circular. It's both. There's a cycle that we go through with each generation, but yet, so as history continues, there will be an end. We keep making the same goofy mistakes, right? You've learned this with age, right? By the time your generation wasn't the young generation, the next generation came up behind you and said, we're going to fix all the problems you started. You laughed. Why? Because that's exactly what you said. Right, boomers? Right? Right, Gen Xers? Right, millennials? Right? We got to fix all the problems you boomers gave us. Right? Now watch us dirty up the planet even worse, okay? So that's the pattern you see in the Bible. So one of the ways this is demonstrated in the Bible is through a theme we can call exile. That is to say that there are themes of exile, people being excommunicated or kicked out or go through an exodus of some type. And that is a pattern. And that's what I want to look at today. When you get this, Joseph is going to make complete sense, okay? Especially what it is that we'll look at Sunday night and next Wednesday. So I want to show you this theme. Let's start with Adam and Eve. This is obvious, isn't it? Adam and Eve are, of course, exiled from the garden, right? Their sin leads to exile. And that is itself, in their case, an act of judgment. And so when they leave the garden, they are leaving their identity. They're leaving their hope. In fact, they're leaving life. In the garden, so long as they're there, they have access to the tree of life. And with that comes wisdom and grace and everything. But when they are exiled, they go from the garden to the wilderness. And this immediately shows up in how they interact with each other. They blame shift and they complain and all that sort of stuff. In his book on the theology of Exodus, Morales says, in being driven out of the Garden of Eden, humanity did not merely lose life defined as paradisal existence. Rather, people lost the fountain of life and the source of all peace, joy, and fulfillment. That is, they lost the relationship with God himself. What's more, exile from God, they lost something of their own selves as well. Created for life with God, to find their highest satisfaction and rest in him, banished humanity lost its defining purpose and basis for significance. Now, that is very important for you to grab, because if that is true of our first parents, that is true for you and me today. The problem with the world is that we are still in exile. And what you get in the rest of the Bible is an effort to go back to the garden. And this theme shows up over and over again, and we can only barely touch the surface. So the exodus of Adam and Eve is the story of humanity today. We continue to search aimlessly to settle for paradise. Now, we can do that through idolatry, right? We elevate earthly things to Godhead. If I give my all to this relationship or to this family or to these kids or to this job or this career or this education or to carnal ambitions, whatever it might be, then I will have my garden. I can retire early. I can live on the beach. I can be loved, right? Whatever it might be. And so we can establish our own little gardens. And we discover quickly these gardens aren't paradise. They bring with them their own brokenness. So Adam and Eve pass from life to death, making death the ultimate exile. And it's going to be very important for you to see in the story of Joseph. Death itself is a type of exile. It's the ultimate exile. Right? Now you can move that to the story of Cain and Abel, right? So the primeval history leading up to the flood. Cain, the older brother of Abel, of course, he murders his younger brother. He is then exiled farther east from the garden. And we've done the east talk 1,000 times out of Genesis. And remember that Cain is compared to an animal, right? So here's Cain, and before he murders his brother, God comes to him and says, there's a serpent at the door, right? So sin is crouching at the door. In fact, I've heard this theory. I think it's fascinating. I don't know if it's true or not. What is the door? It could be a metaphor of the heart or something like that. It could be literal. Adam and Eve, remember that the garden is inside of Eden. They are exiled from the garden. There's a cherubim there. They could still be in Eden or just outside of Eden. So the door could be the gate that is guarded. Like the sin is crouching like an animal at the door. Well, who's on the other side? Who was at the other side of the door? It's the serpent. So Cain is described in animalistic terms serpentine terms, we could say, right? And when he says you have to master, you rule over it, that's borrowed language from the temptation, Genesis 3:2. We've looked at that in the past. Well, he decides the way of exile. He murders his brother. And what does Cain then do? He then goes farther east in exile, his own exodus, and he establishes a city. A city is itself its own type of garden. That is, it provides for him security, peace, and everything else. Remember, Cain says, my judgment is too great. If I leave, I'm going to be killed, which is ironic because he, as a murderer, is afraid of being killed, right? So what does he do? He builds the city, and he names it after his offspring. So there's that theme of seed that runs throughout the Bible, particularly in Genesis. And of course, the city is an effort at self-protection and whatnot. So in fear of death, that is exile, he builds a city to protect his life. Now, after the flood, what is it that we get is mankind then builds another city. It's the same story of Cain and Abel. So Cain goes to build a city. That's disastrous, and nothing but sin comes out of that. After the flood, people gather again, and they build another city. It's nothing but disasters there. And what does God do to the citizens of Babel? He exiles them by changing their languages. And what comes out of that comes city-states and nations and kingdoms who are at constant war with themselves. And so you have this increase of exile. Practically speaking, is they leave each other into other parts of the world. But spiritually speaking, is that as exiles, they war with each other in search of the garden. And they can't seem to find it. And then we get to the patriarchs. Abraham comes, and the first thing we discover about him is he lives near Babel in the city called Ur. And we have found Ur. And he's immediately exiled, right? A better term here may be exodus. Actually, the better term is going to be sojourner, because that's the word we have. In fact, I'll give you, this word sojourner shows up all over the story of Abraham. So we're not going to read all of these, just so you can see it. Genesis 12, Genesis 15, Genesis 20, Genesis 21, again 21, and then Genesis 23. Actually, this last one is interesting. He's called a sojourner, calls himself a sojourner and a foreigner. What is a sojourner? It is someone from the outside that has come in, but he's never part of the inside. He's an immigrant. He's a foreigner. He's a sojourner. Of course, the irony of that is, how does this immigrant treat an immigrant named Hagar? He exiles her. She is exiled from Egypt because the sojourner goes down there, and then he mistreats her, human trafficking, slavery. It's very evil what he does. And then he excommunicates her. He exiles her, and she goes through her own Exodus story. All right? Now she becomes a sojourner because God intervenes and shows up and blesses her. What God is doing with Abraham is he is taking an exile, right? He lives near Babel. Taking an exile, calling him out from among the nations of exiles. And he has given him a name. Right, and remember, that's the point of the Babel stories. They want to make a name for themselves. So they take the fruit and choose their own wisdom. God then chooses Abraham, says, I'll make a name for you. And so instead of an exile, he becomes a sojourner. He is a stranger in a strange land. And God promises Abraham, if you will follow me, I will give you a home. It's a promised land. But the story of Abraham is he continues to wander. And near the end of his life, he purchases land to bury his wife. And that is all that he owns of this earth. Everything else, he's just a sojourner. By the way, this theme shows up later in the Exodus story. This may be, so compare these two verses. This is Abraham. God said to Abraham, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur. And then to the Israelites, this is the Ten Commandments. God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Exodus theme of the Bible and the exile theme of the Bible overlap quite a bit. Right? And so a lot of rabbis will say that everything that happened to the Jews in the generation of Moses had already happened to Abraham on a smaller scale. Right? He comes out of Egypt, right back to the promised land. He faces temptations there. A lot of the same overlap. Well, that's Abraham. We could do others, but you get the point. Isaac, too, will be described, as we saw Sunday night, as a sojourner. This is Genesis 26. The Lord appeared to him and said, "Do not go down to Egypt, dwell in the land which I tell you. Sojourn in this land. You will be a stranger in a strange land. This is not your home." Now, to Isaac, it is his home. This is the only home he's ever known. But he's told by God, "You're a sojourner here. And see yourself as a sojourner." Everyone else is in exile because they're sons of Adam. They're sons of Noah. They're descendants of the Babylonites, right? But you are to see yourself as a sojourner who one day I will give you a home. You and your descendants. And that is the promise that Isaac holds on to. And then we meet Jacob, which is, we've read a little bit about Jacob this week. He is constantly in exile, isn't he? For example, he is exiled by Esau and Isaac after Jacob deceives his father and brother. By the way, you remember how Jacob deceived his father who has poor eyesight? He puts an animal on his arms because his brother's hairy. His brother hadn't fully evolved. It's the way we joke about it in our family, okay? Now, can you think of a story where someone committed a sin that we've looked at already that used the language of animal? It's Cain. Sin is crouching at the door, and it wants you. So what does Jacob do? He embodies the imagery of an animal to deceive his father and his brother. And so what does Jacob have to do? He has to go into exile. He has to flee for his life, and his mother has to help him with that. Well, then what happens is later he is exiled by Laban, right? So the mandrakes and all that, and the spotted, speckled goats and all that sort of stuff. Jacob ends up having to flee Laban. But in fleeing Laban, he then meets his brother. And you remember what he does there? A bit of a cowardly thing. He sends all of his servants, sends all these gifts ahead of him. He's the last in line, right? And they have that reconciling scene. So he's been exiled from his family, exiled from his father-in-law. He is constantly, as a sojourner, back and forth between things. Now, we could go beyond Genesis and see these themes. Notice we're skipping Joseph. The Exodus is a story of rescue from exile, right? Because the story of Joseph ends with the people of Israel in Egypt, but they don't belong there. That is not the promised land. That's going to be a big theme we'll see next Wednesday. So in order to go to the promised land, they have to be exiled by Pharaoh. And so the Exodus is a type of exile. They are exiles as slaves, but it isn't until they are sent away, the opposite of the Hagar story. So the whole story of Exodus is exile. Judges is a constant cycle between exile and return. Right? So the Philistines come in and send them into captivity. And then the judge comes up and says, no, not today, Satan, and delivers the people, and they're back home. And then another group comes, right? This is the story of Judges. It's one of exile and return. The prophets foretold of exile of the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Of course, the Babylonian exile is the biggest one. What about the story of Esther? What happens to Esther? She enters a beauty pageant and she is forced into marriage. She is exiled. She is an exile as an Israelite among the Persians. And then she is called to liberate her people from exile. What about Daniel and his friends are exiles in Babylon, right? And they're having to live as exiles. David is an exile from Saul. You remember when we were in 1 Samuel, Saul takes up a spear, throws it, and I always imagine it like just going right by his head. He's like, well, I guess it's time for me to leave, right? And then later he flees to his wife, Saul's daughter, and what does she do? She turns him over, basically. He has to flee, right? Because she deceives David and deceives her father and all that sort of stuff. So he actually ends up having to leave Israel to go to the Moabites for the safety of his own life. He even gets exiled by his son Absalom later. And we could look at other stories. Now, the story of Joseph embodies this theme. You're in Genesis 37. It's in the very first verse. Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings. It's right there. I bet you ignored it this entire time. It's right there. Tomorrow when you read through this, you'll see it. Jacob like his father, and like his father before him, is a sojourner. And the story of Joseph is a story of an exile. So this is a major, major theme in the Bible. So that's the Old Testament. Again, we're skipping Joseph where this really shows up. We can come to the New Testament. We can see this theme just continues. Following the fall of Eden, as we said, humanity ever remains in exile. We don't want to be in exile. We want to go home, whatever that may mean. So we want to create our own garden. And that may involve, I don't know, invading Ukraine. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of a wild idea there. But for the Christian, though we live in a world of exiles, in the spirit of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we are seen as sojourners. We are described as sojourners in the Bible. We are strangers in a strange land. This is why Christians, we should turn on the TV the 1 or 2 times a decade we do this, thinking, I don't recognize this world. I don't recognize this way of thinking because I'm a sojourner. I'm a stranger in a very strange land. And so we embody the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let me see if I can show this to you in the New Testament. When Stephen is being executed, right? He gives this, I think it's the longest sermon in Acts. He says, God spoke to this effect, that his offspring, there's the seed language, would be sojourners in a land belonging to others. Is he only talking about Abraham there? I don't think so. Stephen is saying, look, we Jews, even when we possess the land, we are sojourners. This world isn't our home. Or consider what the writer of Hebrews says. These all died in faith, right? The Faith Hall of Fame. He says, not having received the things promised. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, they all die, but they don't possess the land. Having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. Right? And so the New Testament then comes and says, their story becomes our story. And you can do this with the story of Jesus. Jesus embodies this story in himself. We've done this several times before. If you go back to the story of Matthew, particularly the opening chapters, it is a retelling of the story of Israel. And in that is the story of exile. So Jesus is both human and he's a son of Israel. And so we see the exile narrative of both sides in Jesus. For example, he is exiled to Egypt in Matthew chapter 2. What happens is a tyrant rises and he has to go to Egypt. And so Matthew makes a big deal out of this. He is exiled to Egypt for protection. But when he comes back, Matthew quotes Hosea, out of Egypt I call my son. That verse has nothing to do with the birth of Jesus. Matthew says, look, Jesus is embodying the story of Israel. Just as Israel had to come out as exiles to the promised land, so Jesus must confront a Pharaoh-like king in Herod and return from Egypt as Israel did. Likewise, after he is baptized or he passes through the waters, the Red Sea, he goes not for 40 years into the wilderness, but for 40 days and 40 nights. There he faces the same temptations as his ancestors. And it's the language of exile. Then Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. It's exile. So he embodies the exile narrative of Israel. One other example here is in Matthew chapter 8, we looked at this several weeks ago. People are coming and say, hey, Jesus, I want to follow you. One of the things he says is, I have no home here. Are you sure you want to be a sojourner like me? That's the question. Remember, one guy says, well, let me bury my father, and then you can have any home that you want. He said, no. Let the dead bury their dead. They'll enter into exile. You follow me. It makes sense now, doesn't it? Jesus embodies the sojourner story, the narrative of the patriarchs. He's a man without a home. Now, he has a home base, if you will. It's probably the home of Peter and his family, or Mark and his family. The upper room's probably where the gospel writer Mark, his family lived. But that's a matter of debate. And so think about what the story of Jesus is. Prior to his incarnation, Jesus is exalted above the heavens. And then when he becomes an incarnated man, he is then sent into the story of exile of humanity. He lives in this broken world where we are trying to find our home. But in binding the story of Israel, he chooses the way of a sojourner. Now, what is the end story of Jesus? He goes into exile, death, where he is cast out by his own people. He is exiled. And then what happens is he is raised. And according to Paul, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess Jesus is Lord, right? Notice again how Paul writes this. Have this in mind among yourselves, which is in Jesus. Notice the application already there. Who though he was in the form of God, so equal in all ways, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking the form of a slave, doulos, being born in the likeness of men. Being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. Therefore, God has highly exalted him. The exile, remember this, the exile has been exalted. And that exaltation doesn't come when he seeks his own exaltation, but when he comes in obedience to the Father. This is the story of Joseph, by the way. It begins, as we read, he thinks he's exalted. He had dreams. But in his exaltation, he goes into exile. But when he learns to trust in the Lord, he is exalted by God. Right? And it ends with him saying, I'm still in exile, by the way, when he talks about his bones. So I just ruined the next two studies together. But at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and earth, under the earth. Every tongue confess Jesus is Lord, glory of God. So you see exile and exaltation in the writings of Paul. By the way, the apostles continue this. This will give you one example. 1 Peter says, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to those who are elect exiles in the dispersion. Now, the dispersion here are Christians who have been dispersed because of persecution. But how does he describe them? They are exiles. He is a fellow exile. In the same book, he says, if you call on him as Father who judges impartially, according to each one's deeds, conduct yourselves with fear throughout the time of your exile. I mean, it's just very clear. Later, he'll add in 1 Peter 2, Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles. Now he's taken the two ideas and he's merged them because both are true simultaneously. We may be exiled by the world, but the truth is we're sojourners in this world. This world isn't our home. So for the Christian, then, we are sojourners in a broken world of exiles. And in that situation, we wait for an eternal home, the kingdom of God. And this is Paul's point in Philippians 3. Our citizenship is not in the United States of America. Legally it is, yeah, sure, and that's helpful, okay? But our ultimate citizenship is in heaven. And from it, we await a Savior. It makes sense now, doesn't it? Because we've always been sojourners. And it isn't just that we're sojourners, but everyone you meet is in exile. That's why there's so much anger and brokenness and anxiety and worry and bitterness and envy and hurt in this world. We're all trying to knock on Eden's door. We can't seem to find it. We're in constant exile. We are in the wilderness. And here comes the believer saying, God has promised me a home. Therefore, the search is over with. I'm not an exile. I'm a sojourner. I'm an immigrant. I'm a foreigner. And this is a strange world I live in. The day will come when I will be brought home. Well, there are some points of application I want to highlight here just as you go home. And again, we'll look at it from the lens of Joseph. So if you want to, as you go through the story of Joseph in the next few days, next week or so, see if you can find these themes of exile and exaltation. That's going to be our two E words. They'll be everywhere. And you may even notice some things you never noticed before. And I'll highlight those in the next two rounds. I just want to make a few points of application because it brings it all together. First of all is that we are sojourners in the land of exiles. We've talked about this. Ever since the fall, humanity has been in exile, and it is why we do foolish and irrational things. Right? Again, you turn on the TV, and if it crosses your mind, this is bizarre, it's because you are a sojourner in a world of exiles. Right? The blind are leading the blind, and we are falling into a pit. Is there a story in the Bible where someone in exile falls into a pit? I think his name is Joseph. Oh, and Daniel, by the way. Do yourself a favor and see if you can find the parallels between Joseph and Daniel. I'm ruining. I've already got Sunday night, Wednesday night, next Wednesday night prepared, so I'm ruining it. I'm giving you spoiler alerts here. So what we do or what the world tries to do is find peace and joy and contentment, all that through the means of a variety of idols. But like Abraham, we are called out of the world. We don't walk aimlessly. We are not blind, but rather we follow the Lord, and we await a more permanent home. And this is what we're doing now. We are waiting to go home. And we have a home, and that home has been promised to us. Secondly, that means this world is not our home. Paul makes this point in 2 Corinthians. Yes, we are of good courage, and we would rather be away from the body and at home with the Lord. That makes sense, right? I think the deeper you go into your faith, the more you long to be with Jesus. And the less you desire to be with Jesus, the farther away from your faith you are sinking from. It is a great barometer to judge where you are spiritually. That I don't want to be here any longer. You've heard me say before, I do want to walk my little girl down the aisle, marry them off, threaten the young man with his life. But I want to do those things. I want to retire with the missus and visit Scotland and see my ancestral home. I got to take Manna to Rome because she's insisting. But I want to do those things. Man, if I could be with Jesus right now, I'll ask him to put Scotland in heaven. But this isn't our home. And we err when we make this our home. Likewise, in Romans 12:2, do not be conformed to this world, be transformed by the renewal of your mind. By the testing you may discern what is the will of God is, what is good and acceptable and perfect. Don't be conformed to this world. Be transformed by the gospel. Why? It's not your home. Colossians 1:13, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his Son. We've gone from one world to another. Our citizenship's gone from one kingdom to another. 1 John 3, we know that we have passed out of death, exile, into resurrection, exaltation, because we love the brothers. Philippians 3:20, our citizenship is in heaven. We saw that earlier. Finally, Hebrews 13:14, for here we have no lasting city, but we seek one to come. We are sojourners. Sojourners. Thus, we must guard from putting all of our hopes and dreams into this world. Think about it. Whatever you may lose, we know that we ultimately lose nothing. And whatever it is that we may gain, we ultimately gain nothing in comparison to what we will receive. Isn't that Paul's point in Romans 8? The sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed to us. We're sojourners. So this world is not our home. Thirdly, this world is not our friend. Acts 2:40, when Peter preaches, they ask, what must we do to be saved? And one of the things he says is, save yourself from this crooked generation. This world is not your friend. We have three great enemies. We've looked at them multiple times in the past: the world, the flesh, and the devil. And trying to make any one of those your friend will end in disaster. This world is not our friend. Conformity to the world is anti-gospel. At the root of theological liberalism is trying to update Christianity to where the world will like us. And that is a failed effort. In my first book, I have a whole chapter. I think it's one of the first chapters called the Irrelevancy of Relevancy, something like that. And that is that if you spend your entire theological trajectory in your worship trying to be cool, you are confessing you are not cool. It's like a dad of teenagers. Maybe y'all have done this, or your dad did this. You come in and you try to talk the lingo of teenagers. Yo, homies, what is up, my boy? Something like that. And they look at you thinking, Dad, you're not cool, right? And because you try to be cool, you had already proven you're not cool. And so if you try to update Christianity so that it can be relevant, you just demonstrated it is not relevant by worldly minds. But if you're consistent with the gospel, showing that times may change, but the hope of the world has not, then you've proven you're relevant for whatever trends come next. And you don't need to keep up with them. So, friendship with the world is enmity with God. I believe that's Paul as well. Fourthly, Christians must be careful about turning this world into our home. What I have in mind here, and I've really noticed, say in the last 10 years or so, is the culture wars we are really doing this. What do we want? Do we want to see people to become Christians, or do we want to see America become Christianized? Those are two very different things. And so what we do is we say that Christianity looks like this at the public level, and unless we buy into that, you're not a good enough Christian. What it is, we're trying to save a party or a city or a nation or a policy or the nation's morality, whatever it is. And so we sink all of our efforts into that. You would do the world a favor and the kingdom of God a favor to save souls rather than to garner votes. And we Christians are struggling with that. And a big part of the reason is because politics has become one of our main idols. Think about it. We think that if our people can get in power and pass our policies, then we'll have the Garden of Eden. It'll look like the 1950s if you're on the right. It'll look like the 1960s if you're on the left. It's not going to happen. I'm willing to bet in 2 years, presidential election, you're going to hear the same thing you've heard at every presidential election in my lifetime. This is the most important election of our lifetime. I'm just guessing. I'm not a prophet or a son of prophet, but I've noticed a pattern. And now what I hear is, well, I know we always say this is the most important election, but this one is the most important election. You've been saying that the last 4 elections. All right. So we have to be real careful about putting all of our eggs in cultural wars, political wars, economic wars, or international fair wars, rather than the mission that we are sojourners seeking sojourners. Finally, this world needs Christ's love. There's a real temptation we have here is when we say the world is not my home, to then think that means we pull out. I've seen some funny memes about the Amish and the COVID. I won't share those because it will hurt someone's political opinions. But you know, there's been some studies showing that the Amish have not hardly been affected by COVID. A big part of the reason is because they ain't around us. Right? That's the whole point of being Amish. Right? That's part of it. And that mindset, it can be very tempting for a lot of us, and has been throughout that history. But if you read history, and I got a Lewis quote that will demonstrate this. Though we are looking for a permanent home, we as sojourners have a responsibility to where it is that we live. Abraham does that. He doesn't tolerate the nations coming to threaten Lot's life, for example. So what does he do? He rounds up an army and he whoops up on the bad guys. You know, he does things in this world. He's still a sojourner, but he's got responsibility for the good. Remember that Abraham is called to be a blessing to the nations, not isolated from the nations. And so that expectation has gone on to Israel, and it now continues to, I believe, the church. Through the means of the kingdom of God, we are called to be a blessing to the nations. That's why we do missions. It is why we do charity and everything else. There's a C.S. Lewis quote where he's dealing with the criticism that Christians are so heavenly minded they're no earthly good. So this is from Mere Christianity. I've probably read it 1,000 times here. Continually looking forward to the eternal world is not a form of escapism or wishful thinking, but one of the things a Christian is meant to do. It does not mean that we are to leave the present world as it is. If you read history, you will find that the Christians who did the most for the present world were just those who thought most of the next. The apostles themselves who set on foot the conversion of the Roman Empire, the great men who built up the Middle Ages, the English evangelicals who abolished the slave trade, all left their mark on the earth, precisely because their minds were occupied with heaven. It is since Christians have largely ceased to think of the other world, they've become so ineffective in this. Here's the big quote: aim at heaven and you will get earth thrown in. Aim at earth and you will get neither. And he's right. He's right. Read the New Testament again, especially when it comes to slavery. The New Testament documents are clearly anti-slavery. It recognizes that seems to be a permanent reality, but it writes in such a way as it calls masters slaves and slaves masters. In the eyes of God, you're both sojourners. You're both children of God with equal access to the kingdom of God. That's the door you need, the intellectual door you need to abolish slavery. And it took a while, but it happened. And we fought a war over it. In England, I was doing some research on George III, listened to a podcast about him, and he was very anti-slavery. That's why under William Wilberforce, he was a big advocate of abolishing the slave trade. I believe one of the first kings to never own a slave during that period of colonialization and slavery and stuff. It was interesting. It was with Moeller. There's a new book out about King George III. It's like 700 pages. I'd like to read it. I just can't make it a priority if it's going to be 700 pages. But anyways, the Israelites, you remember in the law, it says that the way you treat immigrants matters because you are an immigrant. The way you treat the sojourner matters because you are a sojourner. The way you treat the slave matters because you were in bondage yourself. So aim at heaven, you'll get earth thrown in. Aim at the earth, you'll get neither. So we are sojourners in a land of exiles. And I think that, perhaps more than anything, will help us navigate the continued decline and moral malaise of this nation. What else do you expect? We are blind, and the blind lead the blind fall into a pit. The good news is, as we'll see Sunday night, God meets us even in the pits. And from the pit to slavery, from slavery to imprisonment, to the exaltation. It's the story of Joseph. It's going to be good. Okay, anything you guys have read this week or anything other than mandrakes and spotted goats? And think about